The first story, the Midnight Express. The trap didn't slam shut. It closed with a soft, damp click, like the sound of bones settling in an unnatural joint. The massive door to the service technical room at Deep Hill Sun Station, hidden behind rusty panels and webs so thick even spiders feared to venture there, slid shut silently, severing the last thread connecting us to the world of light, fresh air, and the laws of physics, which suddenly seemed so fragile. I was the last to slip through the gap that Digger, I know, our unofficial leader, had pried open with a crowbar, a hint of sadistic pleasure in his effort. The air changed abruptly and irrevocably, from the scent of the night city, petrol, dust, and the freshness of a recent rain, to the stale, heavy breath of a century. It smelled of oil, oxidized metal, damp mold, and something else, sweetish and putrid, that clung to the back of the palate. "We're in." Digger's voice, usually loud and brash, here in the stone sack, grew quiet and shrank, echoing dully in the absolute darkness. The flashlights clicked on almost in sync. 3 beams of white, harsh light cut through the gloom, revealing giant cast-iron beams, piles of rusty crates, and rails disappearing into the blackness. Lara, the only girl in our trio, instinctively grabbed my hand. Her fingers were icy. Fun, right? I tried to sound cheerful, but my joke fell into the darkness like a stone down a well and didn't even make a splash. "Nothing fun, Mark." Digger cut short, sweeping his beam across the walls covered in graffiti and layers of old whitewash. "This isn't a tour. Deep Hill is a ghost station. It was closed in '54 after the tunnel on the stretch to Kilmartin collapsed. They said it was groundwater. Officially, 5 people died. Unofficially, they say a train with people went into that tunnel and never came out. They searched for it. Never found it." He said it with such a knowing look, as if he had been personally present at those events. Digger was a walking encyclopedia of all urban legends and underground anomalies. His blog, Urban Phantoms, garnered thousands of views. Today's raid was his obsession to find the legendary Midnight Express, the ghost of that very missing train, rumored to sometimes appear on the abandoned tracks. "So, we just wait?" Lara asked, her voice trembling. "We wait. According to the legend, it appears here." Digger kicked the rail with his boot, exactly at 1:23 a.m. The time when the dispatcher shift ends, and the dead hour begins on the old lines. We settled on the cold concrete of the platform. Time flowed unnaturally slowly, saturated with dampness and silence. Not the living silence of a forest, but a dead, oppressive one, as if we had been buried alive under hundreds of tons of earth and concrete. Sounds came from the darkness, water dripping somewhere, metal creaking as if from thermal expansion, and once I thought I heard a distant, muffled child's cry. I chalked it up to tension and a mind playing tricks. Exactly at 1:23, we froze at, first, nothing, only the pounding of our own hearts in our ears. Then Lara squeezed my hand so hard the bones cracked. "Do you hear it?" First it was a barely perceptible hum, a vibration in the rails transmitted through the soles of our boots. Then the hum grew, turning into a distant but confident rumble. From the tunnel on the left, from the very direction of the collapse, a wind began to blow. Not a fresh draft, but a stale one carrying the smell of old paper, dust, and ozone, like after a severe thunderstorm, and then it appeared. First, 2 dim points in the utter blackness. They didn't so much shine as push apart the gloom, as if it were in pain. A train, a single carriage. It rolled out of the tunnel almost silently, save for the clatter of wheels over the rail joints. It was old, an A-type I'd seen only in yellowed photographs in history textbooks. Dark green, peeling paint, matte, scratched windows, behind which there was not a single hint of the interior. It slowed down, and with a quiet, hissing sigh, stopped right opposite us. The doors slid open with a pneumatic screech, granting access to its belly. Inside, a light was on. Yellow, dim, flickering like a dying, incandescent bulb. The carriage was empty, worn brown plastic seats, handrails losing their chrome, and a floor covered in dirty linoleum. At the very end, by the door to the next section, a conductor sat with his back to us. His entire figure exuded incredible fatigue and detachment. He wore a uniform from Soviet times, heavily worn. "Well, heroes," Digger hissed, and a note of excitement returned to his voice. "Let's go for a ride." He was the first to step into the carriage. Lara hesitated. "Mark, maybe we shouldn't. I feel sick." "I think someone's in there." "It's your imagination," I tried to reassure her, though I felt uneasy myself. "Just an old service carriage. Lucky we caught it. Digger will be a legend." We entered, the doors closed behind our backs with the same pneumatic groan. The air inside was even heavier than on the platform. The sweetish putrid smell was thicker here, almost tangible. The train started moving. The jerk was unexpectedly sharp, throwing us against the handrails. It picked up speed, relentlessly pulling into the tunnel leading towards the collapse. The conductor didn't move. He didn't turn around, didn't check tickets, didn't utter a word. He just quietly, monotonously muttered something under his breath. I couldn't make out the words, only separate sounds. Not there. End. Forever. "Hey, comrade conductor," Digger shouted, approaching him. "Where are we going?" The conductor didn't react. Digger touched his shoulder. At that very moment, the lights went out. Absolute pitch-black darkness. The darkness that was on the platform now seemed like mere twilight. This was primordial darkness, dense, pressing on the eyeballs. Only the increasing roar of the wheels and the conductor's monotonous muttering could be heard, which hadn't stopped for a second. "Damn," I cursed, banging the body of my flashlight. Lara pressed against me, trembling all over. The light flickered and came back on, yellow and dim. The conductor turned to face us. I screamed. Lara made a sound somewhere between a moan and a wheeze. Digger recoiled, hitting a handrail. It was not a human face. It was distorted by such an ageless, ultimate horror that the brain refused to comprehend it. The skin was stretched tight like parchment, revealing the skull, lips stretched in a soundless scream, and the eyes. The eyes were huge, black, empty sockets in which the same infinite darkness from outside the window was reflected, and from that mouth, from that mask of suffering, came a voice, or rather, voices. Dozens, hundreds of them, merging into a horrible, hissing chorus. The whispers of children, men, women, the elderly, all sounding simultaneously, overlapping each other, creating a cacophony of absolute despair. "You got off at the wrong station?" The phrase hung in the air, multi-voiced, piercing to the bone. The train, which had been picking up speed, now surged forward with such force that we were all thrown against the doors. The lights began to flicker again, as in an epileptic fit. In those fractions of a second of darkness, the conductor's face appeared now a meter away from us, now right in front of our faces, his black, empty eyes looking right into our souls. "We have to get out," Digger yelled, rushing to the emergency exit. He yanked the handle. It didn't budge, as if welded shut. I pulled out my phone. No service. Lara's, the same. The walkie-talkies we'd brought only emitted hissing and those same multi-voiced whispers breaking into the airwaves, and then we heard a new sound. A scraping, quiet, persistent, scratching. It came from everywhere, from all sides of the carriage. We looked out the window. Out there in the utter darkness, outside the glass, there was something. At first, I saw one, pale, long, unnaturally, bent arm with dirty broken nails. It was scraping at the glass, trying to get a grip on the smooth surface. Then another, and another. There were more of them, hundreds of hands, palms, fingers emerging from the darkness. They scraped, scratched, pounded on the glass, trying to break through. Behind them, vague outlines of figures could be discerned, distorted, hungry, desperate. "They want to get in," Lara screamed, pressing herself into the seat. The train raced at insane speed, bouncing on the rail joints, which should have ended dozens of kilometers ago. The flickering of the light accelerated, and in every glimpse I saw their faces. They pressed against the glass, flattened, insane, with gouged-out eyes and lipless mouths stretched into soundless screams. The multi-voiced whisper from the conductor's mouth now came from everywhere, from the walls, the ceiling, from inside our own heads. "Stay with us. Forever. You got off at the wrong station." Digger, in a frenzy, began beating the window with his crowbar. The glass didn't even chip. It only emitted a dull, heavy sound, as if it were made of solid metal. Lara was sobbing, curled up in a ball. I could only stare, paralyzed, at the hellish carnival outside the window. The train jerked violently once more, and the flickering stopped. The light came on and stayed on, steady but still dim. The scraping outside ceased abruptly. Silence. The conductor was back in his seat, his back to us, as if nothing had happened. The muttering had stopped. A new sound broke the silence, a distorted, metallic voice over an ancient intercom. "Next stop, terminus. End of the line. All passengers must disembark." The train began to slow down. Outside the windows, the absolute darkness began to dilute, turning into a thick, grey, swirling fog. The carriage shuddered and stopped with a final sigh. The doors slid open, not onto a platform, but into an endless, fog-shrouded space. Cold, damp air wafted in. The fog shifted, and for a moment I saw the outlines of a dilapidated, cavernous station hall I'd never seen on any map. Dark archways led into deeper darkness, and in the fog, silhouettes stood waiting. Dozens of them. Motionless. Silent. The conductor slowly, stiffly, rose from his seat. He turned his head, just his head, a full 180 degrees to look at us. The mask of horror was gone, replaced by a terrible, empty calmness. He pointed a bony finger towards the open doors. The unspoken command was clear. Our ride was over. Digger, with a lost look, took a step forward, then another. He walked towards the open doors like a sleepwalker, not looking back. He stepped out into the fog. The silhouettes shifted, parting slightly to receive him, then closed ranks again. The fog swallowed him whole. There was no sound. Lara was hyperventilating, clutching my arm. "Mark. No. No." The conductor's finger was now pointing at us. The pressure to obey was physical, a weight pushing us towards the exit. "We can't," I whispered, but my feet were already moving, dragging Lara with me. It wasn't a choice, it was an inevitability. We stepped out onto the damp, cold ground. The fog closed around us, warm and cloying. The doors of the Midnight Express slid shut behind us with a final definitive hiss. Through the dirty glass, I saw the conductor still pointing until the train began to move, silently pulling back into the endless dark tunnel from which it came, leaving us alone. In the silence. In the fog. At the wrong station. We are still waiting for our next train. It's been, I don't know how long. Time doesn't work here. Others are here too, waiting in the fog. They don't talk. They just watch the tunnels. Sometimes a light appears in the distance and a rumble is heard. We all get our hopes up. But the train never stops for us. It just passes by, its windows glowing faintly, and sometimes I see faces I recognize pressed against the glass, their eyes wide with the same terror we felt. We got off at the wrong station, and now we wait. Forever. The second story, The Shadow on the Rails. Locomotive. The 734 was more than just a machine. For Arthur Shaw, it was a cocoon, a capsule that shut out the problems and chaos of the outside world. For 15 years he had been driving the night express Peregrine. On the same route, 500 kilometers of asphalted emptiness, tunnels cutting through mountain ranges, and endless straits leading nowhere under the sparse light of the stars. He knew every rail joint, every dip in the track, every signal light by heart. This was his world. Measured, predictable, safe. Until that very evening, it started with a trifle. A fleeting impression his brain refused to process. Somewhere on the stretch between Pinecrest and Faux Summit Pass, the most remote, deserted section, he glimpsed something on the side of the track, right in the beam of the powerful headlights for a moment, snatched from the utter darkness. A tall, unnaturally straight figure. It wasn't walking, wasn't standing. It simply appeared, like a photograph developed in the black developer of the night, and vanished, swallowed by the rapid passing of 1,500 tons of steel and speed. Arthur blinked, strained his eyes, peering into the gloom beyond the glass. Nothing. Only the flicker of sleepers and the glint of light on. The rails wet with night dew. Must have imagined it, he muttered to himself, taking his hand off the power controller, which he had instinctively moved toward braking. But the imagination repeated. A week later, again on the same stretch, the shadow appeared slightly closer to the tracks. It wasn't just tall, it was rigid, as if cut from black cardboard or cast from hard resin. And again, just for a fraction of a second, long enough to lodge in his subconscious like a splinter of anxiety. The third time, Arthur was sure he wasn't asleep or losing his mind. He even felt an icy shiver run down his spine. He contacted the dispatcher. Kestrel 7, come in. There was a crackle in his headphones and the sleepy voice of the dispatcher. Roman came through. Kestrel 7, reading you, Arthur. Problems? On the stretch between Pinecrest and the Summit Pass. There's someone on the side of the track. A pause. A pedestrian, a trespasser. Roman's voice now held concern. Dunno. Not sure. A tall one. Did the Peregrine pick up anything on the thermal cam? Another pause, longer this time. The clicking of a keyboard was audible. Nothing showing, Arthur. Not a soul for kilometers. You're tired. Your shift's almost over. Get some sleep. I'm not tired, Arthur snapped, but immediately checked himself. All right. Over and out. After that, he noticed the shadow more often. It became his involuntary travel companion, always on that same stretch. It seemed to be waiting for him. Each time it was a bit closer to the rails. First on the shoulder, then on the embankment, then a meter from the steel track. Its obsessive, regular appearance began to erode his confidence, his hard-earned peace. He studied every detail he could make out. The vague outlines, the absence of any facial features, the absolute deathly stillness before and after the moment of appearance. Colleagues at the depot, with whom he cautiously shared, patted him on the shoulder. "Arthur, come on. Monotony-induced hallucinations. Happens to everyone. You need a vacation. Or see an optometrist. Eyesight can play tricks at your age." But he knew it wasn't a hallucination. It was something else. Something real, but existing by some other monstrous laws. Roman, the dispatcher, no longer hid his irritation. "Shaw, is this about your night grandpa again? Let's keep the fantasies to ourselves. Report actual issues." Arthur's loneliness became absolute. He was locked in his cabin with a growing horror that only he could see and no one else wanted to see. The fateful night was stormy. Leaden clouds pressed down on the earth. Icy rain lashed against the cabin window, turning the glass into a mess of water and light. The wind battered the side of the locomotive, making the massive machine sway slightly. Visibility was near zero. Arthur was driving the Peregrine almost blind, relying on radar, instruments, and his muscle memory. He was approaching that infamous stretch. His heart began to beat faster, his palms grew sweaty. He stared into the watery wall ahead, trying to make out the familiar hated silhouette, and there it was. The headlights, powerful as searchlights, pierced the curtain of rain and illuminated something that made his blood run cold. The shadow wasn't on the shoulder, it was standing right in the middle of the track, right next to the rails. It wasn't hiding, wasn't flashing by. It was revealing itself in all its dreadful fullness, as if made denser, more material by the bad weather. Arthur froze. His world narrowed to 2 points. The trembling needles of the speedometer and that motionless dark figure ahead. He waited for it to disappear, as always, to dissolve in the rain, but it remained in place. The train was racing towards it at nearly 180 kilometers per hour, and then the shadow turned towards him. Arthur screamed. What he saw defied reason. Where a face should have been was only a smooth, dark hollow. An emptiness. No eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just a darkness deeper than the surrounding night. His hand yanked the emergency brake lever on its own. An ear-splitting, gut-wrenching screech of metal on metal filled the air. Sparks flew like fireworks from under the wheels, illuminating the surroundings for a moment with an unnatural, hellish light. Everything in the cabin flew to the floor. Arthur was thrown, hard against the control panel. He felt the huge machine beneath him convulse, fighting inertia but continuing to slide inexorably along the wet rails, straight towards that thing. The collision was inevitable. He understood that. At the last moment, before closing his eyes, he saw the smooth surface where the face should have been distort. The emptiness shifted, stretched, spread into a wide, lipless, triumphant grin. A grin of absolute, unadulterated evil, a deafening, yet surprisingly dull impact echoed. It felt as if the train had hit not something solid, but a bag of sand or thick, viscous fog. The locomotive shuddered throughout its entire frame and, with a final hissing sigh, came to a stop. Silence fell, deafening after the recent roar. Only the sound of rain on the roof and the crackling of the stalled engine could be heard. Arthur, trembling all over, unbuckled and burst out of the cabin. The rain instantly soaked him to the bone. He ran forward to the point of impact, expecting to see the worst, but there was nothing there. No mangled body, no shreds of clothing, not a drop of blood. The rails and sleepers were clean, washed by the rain. Only a faint, barely noticeable steam rose from the locomotive. "No, it can't be," he muttered, running along the train with a flashlight, illuminating the emptiness under the carriages. "I saw it. I hit it." Security arrived, followed by an emergency team. They searched for a long time, with dogs, with thermal imagers. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. The radar at the moment of the incident also showed no obstructions. The braking distance corresponds to an emergency stop without an obstacle, a technician concluded, frowning. "Shaw, are you sure you saw something? Maybe an animal? Or a fallen tree blown by the wind?" Arthur didn't argue. He saw their looks, a mixture of pity, disbelief, and irritation. He was suspended from flights for a week for rest and medical examination. He returned home but found no peace. Every night he woke up in a cold sweat, feeling that final impact and seeing that same grin in the darkness. When he first entered his locomotive's cabin after the incident, a strange smell hit him. Not the smell of oil, metal, or ozone from braking. It was a mix of two distinct notes. The sharp, electric smell of ozone, like after a severe thunderstorm, and a heavy, cold, ancient smell of iron, as if someone had run a huge cold file through the cabin. The smell was faint, but persistent. It had seeped into the seat upholstery, the mats, his clothes. No one could air it out. Arthur was soon transferred to another, less demanding route. A new driver, a young guy named Sebastian Howe, was assigned to the Peregrine. Several months passed. The story of the ghost on the rails became a legend at the depot, a tall tale, for entertaining newcomers, about Arthur Shaw who, cracked from loneliness. Once, deep in autumn, Sebastian was driving the Peregrine on that same night route. It was quiet, clear, and frosty. He was drinking coffee from a thermos, listening to music through headphones. Suddenly, he felt an icy chill down his back and took off the headphones. That strange smell was lingering in the cabin, ozone and cold iron. Sebastian winced. They said that smell never went away. He glanced into the side mirror, checking the dimensions of the train, and froze. Coffee spilled onto his lap, but he didn't feel the burn. In the reflection, in the pitch darkness outside the window, he saw not one, but two tall, rigid shadows. They stood side by side, shoulder to shoulder, faceless and motionless, intently watching the rushing train. One slightly ahead, the other slightly behind, like a teacher and a student, or a mentor and his trainee. Sebastian turned around sharply, looking directly into the dark glass. There was nothing there, only his own reflection, pale with horror. Slowly, with trembling hands, he turned back to the control panel. He didn't look in the mirrors again until the end of his shift, and the strange, cold smell in the cabin became slightly stronger from that night on. The third story, the last carriage, a ticket for a third-class open carriage, was an act of desperation, the last available option when all the planes and private compartments had sold out faster than hotcakes at a sale. For Francesca, who was used to a minimum level of comfort, it felt like a return to her student years of poverty and uncomfortable trips home for the holidays. But the deadline for submitting the layout to the printing house in Nizhnevartovsk was set in stone, and the client wasn't going to wait. The station greeted her with a hollow echo, the smell of cheap coffee and sweat. She clutched her laptop, bag, her most prized possession, to her chest and fought her way to the departures board. Train. Nord Express. Her train, an old woman in a headscarf, pushing a cart with a boiling water kettle, shoved a paper cup into her hand and, looking somewhere past her, said in a hoarse voice, "Dear, take a carriage near the middle. Not the first and not the last. The middle is safer on a train, too." Francesca nodded, shoved a 100-ruble note into the woman's hand, and walked along the train, looking for her carriage. The numbers flashed before her eyes. 8, 9, 10. She was tired, exhausted from stressful work and sleepless nights. Her eyes were heavy, and when she saw the conductor in a blue uniform waving at her, by the open door she handed him her ticket without looking. "Your carriage," he muttered, punching her ticket with a composter. Only after stepping inside did Francesca sense something was wrong. The air was different. Not the station's air, not the train's air. It was stale, thick, and cold, smelling of cold ash, dust, and something else, sweetish and musty, like in a long-locked basement. And the silence. It was absolute. None of the usual hubbub of passengers stowing suitcases, no laughter, no sounds from TVs. The carriage was half empty. Single passengers sat by the windows, motionless as statues. No one was talking, no one was looking at their phones. They just sat there, staring into the dark glass, beyond which the city lights had already begun to drift past. Francesca made her way to her berth, number 38, an upper one. Her compartment mates were already in their places. An elderly woman, in a dark dress with a face like a dried pear, sat motionless, her hands folded on her lap, and a man in a worn-out jacket, staring incessantly out the window. They didn't turn around, didn't greet her. Growing cold, Francesca tossed her bag up onto the bunk and climbed after it. She wanted to hide, to disappear. The train jolted softly into motion, and at that moment, the conductor walked through the carriage. The same one, pale, with eyes that held not a single spark. He was checking tickets. His movements were mechanical, precise, devoid of any meaning. He approached Francesca. She handed him her ticket. He glanced at it, then raised his empty gaze to her. "Happy journey," he uttered in a hollow, monotonous voice. "We only have the one." The phrase hung in the air, strange and ominous. Francesca swallowed nervously. "Thank you," she whispered. The conductor didn't leave. He kept looking at her for a few seconds, too long, then turned and shuffled away, leaving a wave of icy air in his wake. Night fell quickly. Francesca, despite her fear and unease, fell into a heavy, troubled sleep. She was awakened by creaks, the clatter of wheels, and the feeling that someone was constantly watching her from above. She half heard new people boarding the carriage at some station. Their footsteps were quiet, muffled, as if they were afraid of waking someone. She was awakened not by a sound, but by a feeling, a sharp, animal, unexplainable feeling of being watched. Dozens of eyes were fixed on her in the darkness, studying her, savoring her fear. Francesca's heart began to pound. Slowly, afraid to move, she half opened her eyes. The carriage was bathed in semi-darkness. Only a single dim blue nightlight burned by the exit. And in this bluish gloom, she saw them. Everyone. All the passengers in the carriage. They were standing in the aisle. A tight, silent crowd. Men, women, old people. They surrounded her compartment, filling all the space. They didn't move. They didn't breathe. They didn't blink. Their faces were turned towards her, pale and indifferent, masks in the blue nightlight's glow. Francesca's breath caught in her throat. A cold terror, sharp as a blade, pierced her entire being. She pressed herself against the wall, trying to become smaller, invisible. One of them, A tall man in a dark coat standing closest to her, slowly, very slowly, tilted his head to the side. His eyes were two black, empty holes. That movement, so unnatural and alien, was the trigger. Francesca scrambled down from her bunk. She wasn't thinking, wasn't screaming. She was driven by a blind instinct to flee. "Open up! Open up!" she screamed, rushing to the end door leading to the next carriage. Her fingers slid over the cold metal handle. She pulled it with all her might, but the door didn't budge. It was locked from the outside, or the inside, bolted shut. She turned around, pressing her back against the cold metal. The crowd of motionless figures still stood their ground. They weren't pursuing her. They were just observing, silently, patiently, and at that moment the train braked sharply with a deafening screech and clang. Francesca was thrown against the door. Her laptop bag crashed to the floor. For a second, there was complete silence, and then a hoarse, lifeless voice came from the speaker. "Final stop. Everyone out." Francesca's heart sank. They weren't supposed to be at the final stop. They had only been traveling a couple of hours. Outside the window, there were no station lights, no buildings, just impenetrable, thick darkness. With a hissing sound, the carriage doors slid open. Outside, there was no platform, no ground. There was only absolute, all-consuming blackness. A cold wind smelling of dust and ozone rushed into the carriage, and then Francesca saw them, the same passengers. They stood outside in a tight semicircle in front of the open doors, waiting. Their faces had changed. The indifferent masks were now distorted into hungry, unnaturally wide smiles. The corners of their mouths stretched impossibly wide, revealing overly even, dull teeth. Their eyes, once empty, now glowed with a dim, predatory light. They weren't looking at the train. They were looking at her. They had come for someone. For her. From the depths of the carriage, the conductor approached her. His pale face was impenetrable. "Stop," he said in the same monotone voice. Francesca recoiled, pushing against the locked door. Outside, the crowd took a step forward. Their silent anticipation was more terrifying than any threat. "No," she squeezed out. "This isn't my stop. I'm going to Nizhnevatovsk." "Everyone goes to the final stop," the conductor replied, and took a step toward her. It was an invitation, or an order. A sudden surge of adrenaline, wild and blind, hit her head. Francesca dashed along the carriage toward the other exit, toward the driver's cabin. She had to warn them. This was some kind of mistake. The empty carriage drifted past her. The bunks were made with clean, sterile sheets. Nothing extra, no traces of people, only her and her pursuers. The door to the driver's cabin was also locked. She beat her fists against it, screamed, but was met only with dead silence. She turned around. They were walking slowly, unhurriedly, toward her down the carriage. The conductor in front, followed by the entire silent, smiling crowd. They were entering the carriage from outside, their figures emerging from the darkness and filling the aisle. There was nowhere to retreat, and suddenly her gaze fell on the emergency brake lever by the window. Red, with a stop sign. Without thinking, desperate, she pulled it with all her might. An ear-splitting screech sounded. The train, already stopped, jolted once more, and all the lights inside the carriage went out. For a second, absolute, pitch darkness reigned. Francesca squeezed her eyes shut, expecting them to pounce on her at any moment. But nothing happened. She cautiously opened her eyes. The carriage was still dark, but empty. No conductor, no passengers. The open doors still gaped with blackness, but no one stood before them. Her heart was pounding wildly. Breathing erratically, she took a step toward the exit, then another. Maybe they had left, maybe it had worked. She stuck her head out into the darkness. Nothing was visible, it was quiet. So quiet it made her ears ring. And then, out of the darkness, right in front of her face, appeared the conductor's face. His grin was the widest and hungriest of them all. "Come out," he hissed. "We're only waiting for you." His cold fingers gripped her wrist with the strength of steel vices. She tried to break free, to scream, but his other hand grabbed her by the neck. The darkness outside turned out to be surprisingly dense and viscous. It wasn't just an absence of light. It was a physical substance, cold and sticky like tar. Francesca was dragged into it, and the darkness immediately began to flow into her mouth, her nose, her ears, stifling her screams. The last thing she saw, before her consciousness faded, was the lights of the train. They were slowly, silently drifting away into the distance, taking her laptop bag and her entire former life with them. The carriage doors slid smoothly shut, and inside, in the blue light of the nightlight, a new, pale and silent figure was already climbing into her place on the upper bunk. And from the speaker came a hoarse, lifeless voice. "Happy journey. We only have the one. The one. Nord Express." Train smoothly started moving, ready to pick up its next passenger who, by mistake, or by cruel fate, would board the wrong carriage. The fourth story, Frequency of the Damned. The transfer to the night shift at the Beacon Hill switching station was supposed to be a punishment. For Kyle Peterson, a veteran dispatcher with 20 years under his belt, it was a quiet blessing. Nestled deep in a concrete bunker beneath the streets of Seattle, the station was a relic, a forgotten node in the increasingly automated web of the national rail network. Its walls, thick and soundproofed, swallowed the city's cacophony, leaving only the hum of aging servers and the soft hiss of the ventilation system. For Kyle, who cherished order and silence above all else, it was a sanctuary, a tomb with a perfect view of the rails. His domain was a semicircular console of analog switches, flickering LED readouts, and two heavy padded headphones that sealed him off from the world. The graveyard shift was a ritual, a thermos of black coffee, a dog-eared copy of a sci-fi novel, and the steady, predictable stream of communication from the handful of freight and late-night passenger trains that still used these aging lines. The first few hours of his shift passed with metronomic regularity. He cleared the 1147 freight for the tunnel under the Duwamish. He gave the all-clear to the Coast Starlight, its engineer's voice rough with fatigue. The rain, a constant Seattle companion, drummed a soft rhythm against the single reinforced window showing a sliver of the wet, dark tracks outside. Then, at 2:17 a.m., the signal broke through. It wasn't a train. It was a fissure in the usual static, a weak, desperate signal that clawed its way through the white noise like a fingernail on glass. Not the one should be driving. Kyle's hand paused over a switch. He frowned, adjusting the gain on his receiver. The voice was a woman's, shredded by interference, choked with a panic so raw it felt like a physical thing in the room. "He's looking at us through the door. Help, please." A burst of static, sharp as a gunshot, and the transmission died. Kyle sat frozen for a full 10 seconds, his coffee forgotten. He keyed his mic, his own voice unnaturally loud in the silent room. "Unidentified transmission. This is Beacon Hill Control. Please identify your train and your emergency. Over." Silence. Then, the calm, bored voice of a grain hauler engineer crackled back. "Beacon Hill, this is Big Red 66. You breaking up? Sounded like you were talking to a ghost. Over. Kyle's heart, which had begun to hammer against his ribs, slowed. A ghost. Yeah. Probably just bleed over from a CB radio, some trucker's domestic drama on I-5. He took a swig of coffee, its bitterness grounding him. His imagination, fueled by the late hour and the isolation, was getting the better of him. But the seed of unease was planted. He found himself listening not to the words of the engineers, but to the spaces between them, to the static itself, searching for that fractured voice. An hour later it returned. This time there was no mistaking it. It wasn't a trucker. It was weaker, farther away, as if broadcast from the bottom of a well. First, a child's cry, not a scream of fear, but a hopeless, weary sobbing that was infinitely worse. Then the woman's voice, now little more than a breathy exhalation, a secret whispered directly into his ear from across a vast distance. He found me. We're going the wrong way. We're already underground. The words iced the blood in Kyle's veins. Underground. He knew these lines better than the streets of his own neighborhood. There was only one set of tunnels that ran deep enough for that description to feel true. The old, decommissioned underground central line. With trembling hands, he called up the master schedule on his dusty monitor. Every active train was accounted for, their transponder signals bright and clear on the grid. His eyes kept drifting to the lower section of the screen, a part of the map that was usually grayed out. The old Cascadia line, abandoned, sealed. A tomb in its own right, a cold dread began to crystallize in his gut. 30 years. It had been almost exactly 30 years since the Westlake Tunnel disaster. A commuter train, its brakes failing on a steep gradient, had overrun the station and plowed into a wall of solid rock deep in the maze of old tunnels. Rescue teams fought for days, but the collapse was too severe. All 47 souls on board were lost. The investigation cited a faulty brake cylinder and human error. The line was sealed, the entrance cemented shut, its memory fading into urban legend. Among the dead was a young woman, a school teacher, and her 6-year-old daughter, returning from a trip to the museum. Kyle's breath hitched. He fumbled for the old paper logs, the ones they kept for archival purposes. His fingers, suddenly clumsy, found the date. The accident report was brief, clinical, but a footnote mentioned the black box recorder. The last intelligible words from the conductor's mic were a frantic, confused transmission about a wrong signal and unauthorized personnel in the cab, before it was cut off by the sound of rending metal. A high, thin sound began to whine in his headphones. It wasn't static. It was the beginning of a scream. It was cut off before it could fully form. And then a new voice filled the channel. It was clear, calm, devoid of any radio distortion. It was a man's voice, smooth and deep, and it carried an authority that felt ancient and absolute. Next up, eternity. The voice wasn't in the headphones. It was in the room. It came from behind him. Kyle spun his chair around, tearing the headset from his ears. The control room was empty. The hum of the servers seemed louder, more menacing. The single window was a black mirror, reflecting his own pale, terrified face back at him. He scrambled for the landline phone, his fingers slipping on the buttons as he dialed the main dispatch center. A busy signal. He tried his cell phone. No service. The console in front of him erupted into a chaos of light. Every single indicator, for every line, active and inactive, flared a bloody red. A discordant symphony of emergency tones blared from speakers he didn't even know existed, and through it all, underneath the electronic bedlam, he could still hear it. The voice. It was in the static of the phones, in the whine of the servers, in the very air. Do not attempt to leave the platform. Kyle backed away from the console, his chair hitting the wall with a thud. The lights in the room flickered, dimmed, and then died, plunging him into a blackness so complete it was suffocating. The emergency lights, thick red bulbs along the floor, stuttered to life, painting the room in the color of blood. The air grew cold. The smell of ozone and something else, something old and damp like turned earth and rusted metal, filled his nostrils. From the shadowy corner of the room, a figure began to coalesce. It was tall, man-shaped, but made of shifting static and darkness, as if the radio waves themselves had taken a terrible form. It had no discernible face, only a suggestion of one that seemed to drink the red light from the emergency bulbs. In one shimmering hand, it held something that looked like an old-fashioned train conductor's punch. Kyle tried to scream, but his voice was gone, stolen by a terror so profound it had severed the connection between his brain and his body. He could only watch as the figure glided toward him, not walking, but moving with the smooth, inexorable certainty of a train on its tracks. The console speakers crackled one last time. The woman's voice returned, but it was different now. The panic was gone, replaced by a hollow, eternal resignation. Final stop. All passengers must disembark. The static figure reached for him. Kyle felt an impossible coldness, not on his skin, but deep within his bones, as if his very soul were freezing. The last thing he saw before his vision tunneled into nothingness was the glint of the silver punch moving toward his forehead, not to harm, but to clip, to validate a ticket for a journey that had been delayed for 30 years. The next morning, the day shift dispatcher found the Beacon Hill station dark and silent. Kyle Peterson was gone. His thermos of coffee was still warm on the console. His novel lay open on the desk. The only thing out of place was the master control panel. Every switch was thrown. Every light was dark. Except one. A single, small red light on the abandoned old Cascadia line glowed with a faint, persistent pulse. And if you listened very closely on certain rainy Seattle nights, on a radio tuned to a dead frequency, you might just hear it. The faint sound of a child crying, the whisper of a desperate woman, and the calm, clear announcement of a conductor who never rests, forever guiding his lost passengers through the tunnels beneath the city, collecting new souls for a train that never reaches its destination. The next stop is eternity, and the conductor always checks your ticket. The fifth story, Shadow in the Steel Walls. The Skyline Express wasn't just a train. It was an engineering masterpiece, a gliding work of art made of polished aluminum and tinted glass. It plied the scenic routes of Colorado, carrying the world's wealthiest and most powerful passengers. Its cars smelled of leather and money, its servers hummed quietly, providing seamless Wi-Fi, and the steaks in the dining car were prepared by a chef poached from a Michelin-starred restaurant in Denver. But beneath the gleaming facade, in the belly of the steel beast, something inexplicable had begun to happen. For Jonathan Gross, the chief conductor, the Skyline was his life's purpose. A former engineer grounded by a back injury, this job kept him near the rails, his one true passion. He knew every centimeter of the train, every hatch, every creaking bolt, and he was the first to notice that something strange was happening to his perfect train. It started with small things: food missing from the buffet, shortages of mineral water bottles, It was blamed on the forgetfulness of new staff or petty theft. Then came the sounds. Quiet, stealthy footsteps in the empty, first-class car late at night, when all passengers were asleep. A knocking sound coming from under the floor, which would stop as soon as someone went to check. A young conductor, Sarah, complained one morning in tears. "Johnny, I was cleaning the shower in Suite B4, and I felt like I was being watched. Right in my back. I'd turn around, no one. But the feeling wouldn't go away. It was like someone was standing in the corner just watching." Jonathan, a man of sober, practical mind, checked the car. The surveillance cameras in the corridors showed nothing. The motion sensors were silent. He calmed Sarah down, attributing it to fatigue and the stressful job. But the incidents multiplied. A billionaire passenger caused a scene, claiming someone had gone through his documents at night. A maid found a piece of lint from old coarse fabric on a perfectly made bed. Fabric not part of the skyline's standard linen. The air in some cars was heavy and stale in the mornings, with a sweetish smell of unwashed body and old dust. Management at the Chicago head office brushed it off. "Gross. This is the most expensive train in North America, not a haunted house. Get your crew in order. Maybe one of your people is spreading stories or has started stealing." Jonathan knew that wasn't it. To his team was tried and true, and he knew something was wrong with the train itself. With the skyline. The decision came to him naturally. After completing a 3-day run on the Denver-Glenwood Springs-Denver route, the train was scheduled for a day of maintenance in a huge, semi-abandoned depot on the outskirts of the city. All staff, except for security at the gate, went home. "I'm staying," Jonathan announced to his deputy. "I'll double-check the inventory. There are some discrepancies." It was a lie. His plan was simple: to spend the night on the train in complete silence and solitude, to lie in wait for their uninvited guest. The depot sank into an oppressive silence. The cathedral-like space was plunged into darkness. Only a few emergency lights cast long, distorted shadows from the steel giants standing on the tracks. The Skyline Express, usually so shiny and proud, now seemed just a giant, lifeless worm. Jonathan walked through all the cars with a powerful flashlight. Nothing. Just his own reflection in the dark windows and the creak of floorboards under his feet. He set up his post in the dining car, sitting at a table by the bar counter. Time dragged on agonizingly slowly. He was almost dozing off when he heard it. Rape. A quiet, metallic, persistent sound. It came not from outside, but from under the floor. Right here in the restaurant. Jonathan's heart began to race. He froze, holding his breath. The scraping repeated. Someone or something was under them. In the technical compartment, in the labyrinth of pipes, wires, and insulation. He knew every technical panel on his train. One of them, for ventilation access, was in the corner, behind the last table. On his knees, with the flashlight in his teeth, he found the almost invisible latches. His fingers were trembling. The scraping grew louder, as if in response to his actions. The panel gave way with a quiet hiss. Moving it aside, Jonathan pointed the flashlight beam into the blackness. The air that rushed out was thick and foul-smelling, the stench of old mold, canned food, sweat, and something unspeakably musty. And there, in the cramped space between the car floor and the outer skin, among bundles of cables and sharp metal edges, he saw it. A tiny nest. A crumpled, dirty sleeping bag, its color long, gone. Next to it, a neat pyramid of empty cans of stewed meat and condensed milk. A solar-powered flashlight, plastic water bottles, and a stack of written sheets of paper neatly tied with twine. With disgust and icy horror, Jonathan reached in and took the stack. It was a diary, homemade from rough wrapping paper. The first entry was dated 10 years ago. The handwriting was still clear, even beautiful. October 14th. Decided today. Boarded the Zephyr. That's what it was called back then. In Grand Junction, a one-way ticket. The conductor looked at me strangely. I just smiled. I'm going home. Forever. Jonathan feverishly flipped through the pages. The entries became shorter, the handwriting more nervous and angular. March. Almost got caught. The maid noticed the water cooler was depleting too fast. Must be more careful. January. Listened to a couple in a suite arguing about money. Funny people. They don't know what real wealth is. My wealth is freedom. No one knows I'm here. I am a ghost. I am the spirit of the train. They are changing the train, calling it Skyline now. So shiny, new. Afraid they'll find my hiding places during the upgrade. But I won't leave. I'll wait it out. It's still the same train, the same home. Ian. Last entry was from just a week ago. The ink was smudged. The letters danced. They suspect something. I can feel it. The conductors are always looking around. They are looking for me. They will find me. But I will not leave. The train is my home. They will not drive me out of my home. No one. Jonathan's breath caught in his throat. He was reading The Confession of a Madman. A man who had lived for 10 years within the walls of this train, like a rat. Who had watched them, the passengers, eaten their leftovers, drunk their water, who was perhaps the very gaze in the back. A quiet, barely audible rustle came from behind him. Jonathan froze, an icy lump of fear stuck in his throat. He slowly, very slowly turned around, the flashlight beam trembling in his hand. He stood there, in the aisle of the dining car. Tall, incredibly thin, almost skeletal. His skin was deathly pale, translucent like wax paper, traced with blue veins. Long matted hair and an equally thick, dirty beard hid part of his face, but not the eyes. The eyes burned with a feverish, wild, animalistic gleam in deep, black sockets. He was clad in rags that might have once been a work uniform, and in his emaciated, bony hand, he clutched a heavy pry bar. He didn't move. He just stood and stared at Jonathan with his insane gaze. Then his lips, cracked and pale, slowly parted, revealing yellow teeth. He rasped a whisper, and his voice sounded like the grating of rusty metal. "Have you come to throw me out of my home?" Jonathan, paralyzed with horror, couldn't utter a word. He just shook his head meaninglessly, scrambling back against the wall. "My home," the stranger repeated, taking a step forward. The pry bar in his hand seemed impossibly heavy, but he held it with familiar ease. "I live here. I don't bother anyone. I just watch. And they all want to throw me out. I won't throw you out," Jonathan forced out, realizing the absurdity of the situation. We can help you." "Help?" The ghost man made a sound like a dry, joyless laugh. "I don't need help. I need my home. You spoiled it. You found my place. Now I'll have to find a new one, or—" He took another step. The smell from him was unbearable, a mixture of sweat, excrement, and despair. Jonathan lunged for the exit. His only thought was to reach the depot doors, the security. But he remembered. The depot was locked from the outside. The guard was in his booth at the gate, 100 meters away, behind concrete walls and steel. There was no help to be expected. He heard heavy, shuffling steps behind his back. And that same hoarse whisper pursuing him, "No one will throw me out of my home. No one." The dining car doors hissed shut right in front of Jonathan's face. He yanked the handle. It didn't budge. The central locking system he was so proud of was working against him. He was trapped in a steel, shining coffin on wheels with its insane 10-year tenant. From the darkness at the end of the corridor came the soft scrape of metal on metal. The pry bar was being dragged along the floor. Jonathan pressed his back against the cold door, watching the shadow approach him. He understood that his perfect premium Skyline Express had always carried more than just wealthy passengers. It carried its own personal nightmare, and that nightmare had come out. The sixth story, Mirror Tunnel. The icy window pane was the only bright spot in the pitch blackness that had swallowed the world. Outside, there was not a spark, not a hint of form, just thick, velvety, all-consuming darkness. The train, gliding almost silently along the rails somewhere deep within the Gotthard base tunnel, had turned the window into a perfect mirror. Jessica Maxwell, her forehead pressed against the cool surface, watched her tired double. The reflection mirrored every wrinkle of a sleepless night, every trace of anxiety left on her face before departure. The trip home to Zurich after a difficult business meeting in Milan was supposed to be a moment of respite. 43 minutes in this, Switzerland's longest tunnel, and she would be free. She reached for a paper cup of cooled coffee, and her reflection did the same. Jessica's gaze lingered for a moment on the empty seat next to her in the reflection. It wasn't empty in reality. Her bag and a crumpled scarf lay on it. In the mirror, however, the seat was perfectly clean, as if freshly made. Strange flashed through her mind. The light must be refracting oddly. She looked away from the seat and back at her own face. And then her heart skipped a beat and began to hammer so hard it rang in her ears. Behind her reflection, in the aisle of the mirror carriage, people were sitting. But they were not the peaceful passengers from her reality, quietly leafing through magazines or dozing in their seats. The man in the jacket who was peacefully snoring in the real world had his head thrown back at an unnatural angle in the reflection, his eyes bulging from their sockets, and a black, thick liquid gushed from his wide-open mouth, distorted by a silent scream streaming onto his white shirt. The woman with the child sitting across from her was clutching not a living child to her chest in the mirror, but a charred, disfigured doll in tattered clothes, her own face cut with deep, bloody wounds. The child in the reflection stared at Jessica with empty eye sockets. Other figures wandered slowly through the ghost carriage. Their movements were jerky, spasmodic, like marionettes with cut strings. One of the passengers had a shard of glass protruding from his throat, and he was laughing hoarsely, soundlessly, grabbing at the necks of invisible neighbors. Jessica spun around sharply, her heart ready to burst from her chest. In the real carriage, idyll reigned. Everything was in its place. The man in the jacket was snoring peacefully. The woman was rocking a living, rosy-cheeked baby. No blood, no horror. Just the quiet hum of the engines and the soft clatter of the wheels. My God. She exhaled, feeling a shiver run through her whole body. It's a hallucination, overwork, lack of sleep. She looked back at the window, now with fear, forcing herself not to look away. The reflection of the carriage was the same, a scene of horror unfolding in complete, sinister silence. And now the figures, these distorted parodies of people, seemed to see her. Their gazes, full of agony and madness, were fixed directly on her. One of them, a young guy with an unnaturally twisted limb, slowly raised his hand and pointed a trembling finger at Jessica. And then she saw it. From the far end of the mirror carriage, a figure appeared, tall, thin, in the impeccable uniform of a conductor. But where a face should have been, there was only a perfectly smooth, pale, eyeless and mouthless mask of skin. It didn't reflect light. It was just there, violating all anatomical laws. The figure moved smoothly, gliding unnaturally between the seats without touching the floor. The phantom passengers shrank away from it, huddling in their seats, wringing their hands in silent horror. The conductor's mask was motionless, but Jessica knew. He was looking at her. He was moving straight towards her, unhurriedly, as if he had all eternity. She tried to scream, to call for the real conductor she had seen just 10 minutes ago, but her throat tightened into a hard knot. An ancient animal fear paralyzed her body. She couldn't move a finger, couldn't tear her eyes away from the approaching figure. Her entire being was screaming, but the sound was stuck deep inside. In the reflection, the conductor stopped right behind her seat. His mask tilted toward her mirror double. Jessica squeezed her eyes shut, praying for the vision to disappear, and then she heard him. The voice was quiet, raspy, like the creaking of unoiled hinges. It didn't come from behind, not from the real carriage. It sounded right inside her head, cold and lifeless, like the smooth surface of the mask. "You do know," it hissed, and every syllable burned her mind like a frostbite. Jessica tried to jerk away again to shake off this nightmarish paralysis, but her muscles wouldn't obey. "We've already crashed?" At that very moment, a blinding white light struck from outside. The train roared deafeningly as it burst out of the tunnel. The mirror instantly vanished, replaced by the landscape outside the window. The oppressive silence in the carriage exploded with sighs of universal relief. Someone laughed. Someone started, talking louder. The world was back to normal. The man in the jacket stretched and yawned. The woman with the child smiled at her baby. Jessica slumped back in her seat, trembling all over. She took a deep, ragged breath, trying to calm the tremor in her hands. Hallucination? Definitely. Need to get some water, calm down. She turned to the window to look at the familiar Swiss alpine meadows, the blue sky, to convince herself of the reality of what was happening. But outside the window there were no meadows, no mountains, no blue sky. The train was racing across a desolate, scorched plain the color of ash and rust. Not a tree, not a blade of grass, not a sign of life. Nothing. Just endless, flat, dead earth. And hanging over it all was the sky. Not blue, not gray, but a thick, motionless, blood-red sky, without a sun, without clouds, without a single break. A crimson dome pressing down on the world with its lifeless weight. Jessica was numb. Her brain refused to process this image. This was not Switzerland. This was nothing. A place that shouldn't exist. The passengers around her seemed to notice nothing. They continued to rejoice at the end of the tunnel, taking out their phones to check for a signal. "Excuse me," Jessica whispered hoarsely to the man in the jacket. Do you see that?" He looked at her with slight bewilderment, then glanced briefly out the window. "I do. We're finally out." It was stuffy in the tunnel, wasn't it? He smiled and went back to his phone. They didn't see it. They didn't see the hell outside the glass. Jessica's heart began to beat in a panicked rhythm again. She scanned the carriage, looking for a conductor, a stewardess, anyone who would share her horror. Her gaze fell on the door at the end of the carriage. There, in the glass insert of the door, the interior was reflected. And in that reflection, the passengers were again mutilated and dead. And behind them, motionless as a statue, stood that same conductor with the leather mask for a face. His faceless head was turned in her direction. Jessica turned around sharply. In the real carriage, there was no one in that spot. Suddenly the train jolted, and the rising hum began again. It was picking up speed. The whistle of the wind turned into a howl. Jessica pressed herself against the glass, and her blood froze in her veins. Ahead, on the horizon of this hellish plain, gaped a black, bottomless hole. Another tunnel. But it was not man-made, not a neat portal in a mountain. It looked like a gaping wound in reality itself, an entrance to absolute, infinite darkness. It was wider, darker, and more terrifying than the first. The loudspeakers in the carriage crackled and emitted a short, distorted click, and from them, in a quiet, familiar, icy whisper that only she could hear, came, "Next stop." The train rushed toward the black void, gaining insane speed. The crimson light of the blood-red sky began to fade, replaced by the advancing darkness. Eternity. Jessica recoiled from the window, looking around wildly. She had to warn them. They had to stop the train. "Listen!" she screamed, jumping up from her seat. Her voice rose to a screech. "We're going the wrong way. Stop this. Just look at the windows." People looked at her with bewilderment mixed with fear and irritation. The woman with the child pulled him closer, moving away. "Madam, calm down," said the man in the jacket, trying to take her hand. She pulled away. She ran down the aisle toward the driver's cab, pounding on the backs of the seats, screaming that they were all dead, that they were in hell, that they had to stop. No one tried to seriously stop her. They stared at her as if she were crazy. Her reality and their reality no longer coincided. Jessica reached the door to the next carriage and froze. In the door's glass window, she saw her reflection, and the reflection of the conductor standing right behind her in her own carriage. His mask was inches from the back of her head. Slowly, overcoming unbearable terror, she turned around. In the real carriage, there was no one behind her. The passengers watched her with fear. But in their eyes, she saw something else. Not just fear of a hysterical woman. Deep in their pupils, for a second, flickered the same reflection as in the window. Distorted faces, empty eyes, a silent scream. They didn't see it consciously, but it was there, inside, hidden under a thin layer of normality. The train roared deafeningly into the second tunnel. Darkness. Absolute, dense darkness, in which even the hum of the wheels disappeared. It was replaced by absolute ringing silence. And then the reflections lit up. Every window, every shiny surface in the carriage flashed with that same mirror world. But now it was brighter, sharper, more aggressive. The figures in it weren't just sitting in horror. They were rushing about the carriage, silently tearing at their skin, banging their heads against the glass, which for Jessica were mirrors. But for them were windows into her world, and they were all looking at her. With hatred, with envy, with hunger. The conductor stood at the center of this madness, motionless like a pole of chaos. His mask slowly turned toward Jessica, and then the lights in the carriage went out. The real lights. The first screams rang out. Real, live screams of panicking people. What's happening? The lights! Where are the lights? Mommy! In the pitch darkness. Jessica heard other sounds. rustling, quiet, shuffling footsteps, sobbing, hoarse, ragged breathing right next to her ear. Someone's cold finger touched her neck. She screamed. Her scream merged with the general chorus of horror. The emergency lights flashed on, dim and flickering, casting everything in eerie, jumping shadows, and Jessica saw the real man in the jacket. Sat in his pose, but his eyes were rolled back so that only the whites were visible, and a trickle of foam ran from his mouth. The woman with the child was clutching her bag in an embrace, rocking madly and monotonously humming something, and her child, the real, living child, lay on the floor under the seat and did not move. Down the aisle, in the flickering light, the figure in the conductor's uniform walked slowly. But it was not the man who had checked tickets. It was that same creature with the skin mask. It was here, in her carriage, in her reality. It walked, and its mask seemed to absorb the dim light, not reflecting it. The passengers froze as it approached, their faces distorting into grimaces of silent horror, exactly repeating the visions Jessica had seen in the glass. The conductor stopped next to her. He slowly leaned down. It smelled of ozone and decay. The flickering light went out, and darkness swallowed everything again. In the silence, broken only by sobs and rasps, his voice sounded not in her head, but right in her ear, physically tangible. An icy whisper. "Welcome to the wreckage. You are with us. Forever." The light flashed again. The conductor was nowhere to be seen, but now all the passengers in the carriage were sitting motionless, upright. Their heads were turned toward Jessica. Their eyes were wide open and empty. The same grimace was frozen on their faces, an exact copy of that mask. They looked at her with soulless, leathery faces. The train raced through eternity, and in the windows, which had become mirrors again, their former selves rushed about and thrashed in hysterics, screaming and crying, trying to break out of their mirror cages into the only place that remained, into this carriage, into this train, rushing through endless darkness toward an unknown, terrible stop called eternity. And Jessica understood that the tunnel would never end.